context. We have, in Turkey, we have the military, we have a sort of authoritarian centre that wants power, and then we have the, what I would call the democracy-minded people. Would that be a fair assessment? And if that's correct, what stage do you think the European Union, or us in Europe, should have known that that was going to happen?
Well, there is the answer to that question is military, as it's in the near future, that force is spent. That's gone, that there is. I don't see, unless something catastrophic happened where the state is collapsing, comes in that, because it's in no position to do with that part there is. The second part, Erdogan, the Turkey is divided at this time, is right, you can put in the middle that there is. The 50% who love Erdogan, there are 50% who hate, who want his head on a spike, that there is. So that is a polarization of the society that there is. How these internal groups are going to work, and remember, it's Fethullah Gulen and those are people who have worked underground for 40 years that there. And they have international things, so and the more important, which is the Kurdish factor that there is mean this. So there is kind of that part there is, so it's a divided society, and especially the foreign policy kind of disasters that there is. It'll be a very rough road ahead for Turkey in the next near future that year. As the issue of EU ascension that year, if you remember, is the European Parliament vote was what 480 versus 37 to stop the further negotiation because of the efforts of Mr. Erdogan's that year, the authoritarian methods that year is. European Union has only incentive is to keep engaged in the sense because the threat of the mass refugee influx that there. That's the deal that there is, but there is no one in the Europe that I know of that there who wants any pursuance of the Turkish entry into the EU. It's a dramatic change that there to allow this instability to come inside the tent of EU that there is. So there will be a limited interaction where you keep them happy in the sense mainly with the financial and those kind of areas there is, so that that floodgate does not open again that there of the refugees that there. But I don't think so. The door of the EU, plus the internal changes, the right shift, the religious aspect that there is in Turkey inside has changed that there. So Turkey coming into the EU tent is I don't see in a near future that. Well, they keep talking.
Brilliant, thank you.
Myanmar has been doing so well, transition and democracy, etc., for the past years, and now everything like seems to kind of break down. Yeah, I would like to let me see whether I can bring this up here. I would like to kind of just disturb that narrative a bit actually, because I've been working in the border areas of Myanmar, the conflict-affected border areas of Myanmar, with various ethnic communities for the last 6 years, doing my PhD on ethnic resistance there. Okay, it worked before. And just working in these areas, I think also for the last 5-6 years, it was actually much less than clear that this transition is really some sort of teleological process towards democracy and peace, because in these very areas violence has erupted, particularly since transition. Great. So my argument here is going to be that the transition actually has been a very top-down, military-led process, yeah, from the very beginning. The generals managed to hold on to much of their political resources and economic resources of power. And what we're seeing now in particular is that they've been expanding their social resources of power, the legitimacy again, amongst the Burma majoritarian streets, so the ethnic majority of the country. The violence at the very time of transition wasn't a coincidence, actually. I think it's very much to do with the transition. And so what I want to do is just give a very brief overview of the history of the army. I think that's important to understand. And then go into these various sources of power and how they play out of a transition. Very briefly, the Tatmadaw, so that's the name for the Myanmar army, has kind of emerged at independence, in the independence struggle against British rule, from the so-called 30 comrades trained in Japan, then called the British Independence, the Burma Independence Army. And all this was really caught up in colonial politics and the politics of the Second World War, where the kind of core of the Burma Independence Army was from the outset pitched against various ethnic communities, many of whom have actually pledged allegiances to their allies. So Kachin Rifles fighting for the CIA, for the US, Karen Rifles fighting for the British against the Japanese. So these very great politics dynamics have pitched ethnic groups vis-a-vis each other from the very outset, and that is very much the root of what we now have as the Myanmar army. There was a brief kind of attempt to reconcile after the country's independence, what is now called the Panglong Agreement of 1947, but very soon the civil war between various ethnic groups kicked off, particularly after the father of Aung San Suu Kyi, you see him here on top, signing the Panglong Agreement, General Aung San, was assassinated, and since Ne Win, the latter on the bottom, has taken over in a coup since 1962. The Tatmadaw very much, so the Myanmar army very much has this perception, self-perception of being the guardian of the nation, that prevents the disintegration of the union. Its whole kind of raison d'etre is very much fighting the internal enemy here, and that's maybe just in a nutshell. Looking at the transition then, so since 2011 very much, the transition wasn't really coming to as a surprise for many people who have been following Myanmar. It's actually been announced even in the regime's mouthpiece, New Light of Myanmar, newspaper here by Senior General Than Shwe, who's been leading the country since the 90s, and here very much speaking about a roadmap to what he calls disciplined democracy. Then also General Thein Sein, who was acting as president between 2011 up until Aung San Suu Kyi took over, we should remember was very much a military man, of course, the general himself. And so why then would these generals in 2011, after holding power that thoroughly in the country, really give in and give up power or give in to transition, kind of, because there was quite some transitioning happening, of course, right? There was political prisoners being released, we saw media liberalization, the NLD, so Aung San Suu Kyi's party could register and compete in the elections, etc. So there's two main explanations we can find in the literature today, and I think it very much makes sense. One is that Myanmar's generals were trying to get the country out of international isolation. So we have to remember there was a lot of sanctions on the country, of course, and particularly out of China's grip. So the Tatmadaw as an institution is a very nationalist institution. It's an institution that is very xenophobic also in many ways, doesn't like international interference. I mean, which kind of army might like that anyways? But so it was really the idea of getting out of the ever-tightening grip of China, which very much tightened the grip in times of isolation. But also 2011 was a position of strength for the Tatmadaw. It was a time of, after years of marginalizing the armed ethnic opposition in the country, with ceasefire politics, with counterinsurgency, but also after years of marginalizing the democratic opposition in the country. So the idea was really to coming here to a transition process out of the position of strength, which was in parts miscalculated, because what we've seen really is, since the transition, large-scale offensives of the Tatmadaw in the north of the country against Kokang positions, Kachin positions, which were actually largely misconceived, which were, I think, based on intelligence failure in many ways, because they have been not very successful. In fact, the conflict has not ceased there since 2011. So coming to these political sources of power, of course the constitution is hugely relevant. So constitution, we're speaking about a constitution that the Tatmadaw made in 2008, where 25%, and this is maybe the better known fact, 25% of the seats in the country's legislative is actually going straight to the military, which basically means the military does have a de facto veto over constitutional reforms, which is at the crux of much of the contestation here in the country, of course. But also we see direct military control of 3 departmental portfolios of 3 ministries, Defense Ministry, Home Affairs Ministry, and Border Affairs Ministry. So defense ministry, okay, that's maybe a bit more straightforward, but I actually want to focus here on the importance of looking and understanding what it means, yeah, when we think about military control of the Home Affairs Ministry and the Border Affairs Ministry. Very important administrative department, the General Administration Department, is based under the Ministry of Home Affairs. Kind of assures that the bureaucracy is actually controlled directly by the military. Employs about 36,000 staff, most of which have a military background, many of which are military officers. It's responsible for things like licensing, land management, collecting taxes, and foreign affairs, foreign aid. So since 2011, the country is opening up, a lot of foreign aid has been coming into the country, much of which is now handled by the General Administration Department, which is part of the Ministry of Home Affairs, which is very much a military outlet in the country, which brings up problems quite obviously. Yeah? So for instance, one high kind of profile peace building project, the Myanmar Peace Support Initiative, which was started by the Norwegians and then became a multi-donor sort of forum to support the peace process in Myanmar. One of their pilot projects was a resettlement project. Resettlement project in Karenni state, which is Thai border, eastern side of Myanmar. Small place, suffered heavy under counterinsurgency in the late 90s, early 2000s, used to have a smaller kind of insurgent resistance outlet themselves. And so the idea was to get the buy-in of local communities in this place to the peace process. With building resettlement villages, all with agricultural opportunities, livelihoods, etc. Turned out that this whole program was something like a strategic hamlet program, actually, where the military was directly controlling who can go in and out of these villages, highly militarized, highly securitized kind of villages. So not to say that this was this was the original intention of the Norwegian government. It is though to illustrate the very dangers of not understanding where and how the military still operates today in the country's politics, particularly when it comes to on-the-ground politics there. Another very important thing then is actually the Border Affairs Ministry, because many of these places that we're talking about that are in conflict in Myanmar are in the border areas. Yeah? And the Border Affairs Ministry has been running a program called the Natala since the 1990s, was part and parcels of a wider ceasefire engagement with armed groups in the country. So Natala is something like the program for the progress of the border areas and national races development. This photo I've taken earlier this year in January on the Indian border, actually, in a place where you have a lot of like Naga communities. And so as you can see, it says like border areas and national races must be developed. So the idea there is very much like a crude developmentalist modernization perspective of we bring development to ethnic border areas, to underdeveloped sorts of hill tribes maybe, and then they will eventually give in. It is very much a program that particularly thinks about infrastructure development in these areas, and which up until now, I would argue, has actually created more conflict than peace in what we can say there, see there. So we go through the different kind of political institutions, we see how relevant or important the Tatmadaw has maintained its position really in the country, but also of course the economy. So much of the economic assets in the country are controlled, or at least the access to them is controlled by the military, by two main military holding companies, the Myanmar Economic Corporation and the Union of Myanmar Economic Holdings Limited, the latter of which is very important or is basically controlling the country's mineral resources. And just to highlight the jade economy, which has attracted quite a bit of attention since a Global Witness report came out in 2015. The jade economy here is really one of the largest economies in the country, making up for about like 50% of the country's GDP, because much of this jade, which is in the north of the country, in Kachin state, is smuggled out of the country directly to China. And so while official kind of estimates kind of put the jade economy to something about like $3.5 billion, Global Witness and others have estimated much higher. Global Witness's estimation is something like $31 billion in 2014. So main profiteers here are particularly Senior General Fan Shui and some other generals who've been holding government positions as well. So here we have to understand how, particularly in conflict areas, we saw the emergence of very violent economies where the military is very directly invested. Which I think not just the jade economy but also strategic infrastructure development kind of might not come as a surprise then that much of the conflict areas here denoted in yellow on this map overlap quite significantly with the areas of economic interest, and we've seen many of the offensives since 2011 by the Myanmar army driven particularly in areas of strategic infrastructure construction. So here for instance pipelines, hydropower, roads, but also control over things like large-scale jade mining, ruby mining, etc. Finally, the Myanmar army has for a long time, we shouldn't underestimate this, also commanded quite some legitimacy in parts of the population, really. We normally have this idea that everybody's been suffering under military rule in Burma for such a long time, which is kind of true, of course, but therefore everybody must hate the Myanmar army. Part of the transition was the Myanmar army manufacturing violence and conflict in border areas to very much re-legitimize itself as the guardian of the nation amongst the biggest major ethnic group, the Bama group or the Bama Street. The campaigns that we've seen now, these very horrific campaigns driven in Rakhine State against the Rohingya Muslim minority, are actually not that different to many of the other campaigns we've seen. So often, you know, we've been focusing on this because Western media has been focusing on the suffering of Rohingya in particular. There's a couple of differences, of course. In Rakhine State, for instance, population density is much higher than in other ethnic minority areas. So leading a very brutal counterinsurgency campaign there has a different humanitarian impact. The Bangladeshi border is a very easy border for refugees to cross. On the Bangladeshi side, you have a lot of refugee camps, international aid, etc. You don't have the same thing on the Chinese border, of course. Yeah? China doesn't let any refugees in, doesn't let the UNHCR operate. Many of these areas that have been in conflict for a long time and which have seen very similar brutal counterinsurgency dynamics have just been off our radars because there was no access at all for journalists, humanitarian NGOs, etc. We are seeing quite some brutal campaigns driven at the moment in the Danai regions of Kachin, in Mudro of Karen, with like thousands of villages fleeing, and with limited to zero access for humanitarian organizations. The actual campaigns that are being driven are very similar. They're called the kind of four cuts doctrine or strategy. The idea is to actually cut local villagers or the insurgents from their support base in local villages, to cut them from food, shelter, intelligence and recruits in particular, which basically means targeting villages and making villages move. Yeah? So what we see in the Danai region at the moment, in Kachin State for instance, is that helicopters would come, planes would come and drop leaflets. Yeah? In villages saying you have to move because the Myanmar army will be coming. So you see, you know, some of these dynamics are not particularly new, even though to us it might seem like this because now we have lots of media attention. What is though new, I think, or what is though quite recent is that this conflict in Rakhine has really served the Tatmadaw to re-legitimize it amongst the street, really, I think in 1 minute, okay? And what we've seen now really remarkably in places like Yangon, for instance, are large-scale demonstrations with thousands of participants protesting in support of the Tatmadaw, because it's very much seen, and this is also the difference here, seen as defending the nation against external enemies. Yeah? So Rohingya Muslims are often seen as external enemies, whereas the others are kind of internal enemies, maybe. Just to conclude with, there's a couple of implications, I think. I mean, one is, I think there was a lot of naivety to expect the Tatmadaw to just give up power from the outset, from the transition when it started in 2011. I mean, if we look at really all the kind of sources of power and also kind of economic profits, etc., I mean, why would the generals just give up power like that, right? It was a very well orchestrated transition, which I think we should really take account of. And for that reason, we should be a bit careful sometimes with terms like transition, democratization, civilian government, etc., also peace process, because all of which they always, I mean, at least this is how they're often used in the media, etc., often assume a sort of teleological progress, with an end point. And I mean, it's quite clear now that this might not well be the case. And I think also with Western donor engagement, not a fan of sanctions at all. But I think we have to be really careful with whom we're working with, and so really analyzing what the actual state is, where the military is being involved, etc., is, I think, the first step of doing this. So that's just my talk. Thanks for listening.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Dr. Rosanna Allen Khan. I am the MP for Tooting, and I am a medical doctor specialising in trauma and emergency medicine, and it's an absolute honour to be here today and to speak about a subject that has become such a passion of mine in the last few months. In particular, I don't have that long to talk to you, but I'd be more than happy if any of you wanted my details afterwards to hear more. So, what possessed me to go to Bangladesh on the border of Myanmar and go to work with the refugees there? Well, I have a background in humanitarian medicine. I've spent 10 years working in Palestine, Pakistan, India, East Timor, Africa, all over the world. And when I became an MP, which was a thoroughly unplanned affair, it was, I really wanted to use my platform to be a voice for the voiceless. And even while being an MP, I had engaged in some humanitarian activities, but when I heard what was going on over the border in Bangladesh, I wanted to go and see for myself. I went to Bangladesh first in October, not to the border, and I was there for another reason, and I said to somebody, can you take me down there? I need to go down there, I need to see what's going on. And nobody would take me, so I convened a meeting in Dhaka of all the major NGOs and the BBC. I said, show me your footage, show me what is happening. They said, unfortunately, this is what's happening. They showed me the footage. They said, but we're not allowed to tell the world. I said, right, I can come back next month and you can report me reporting on it. How about that? Who's going to write me an invitation letter? So 3 weeks later, there I was. And I will say that in the time I have been a doctor and in all of the places I've been to that have experienced geopolitical instability, natural disasters, never have I seen the very worst of humanity as I've seen and experienced in Cox's Bazar on the border of Myanmar. I've been very clear since coming back that what is happening in the Rakhine State towards the Rohingya Muslims is nothing short of a genocide. I will respectfully debate that with anybody if you were to disagree with me. However, as far as I'm concerned, and what I've been saying very publicly in the media and everywhere else, is that it is a genocide. Having studied peacekeeping and conflict resolution, what is happening to the Rohingya in Myanmar is abhorrent. I'm here today to tell you some of the stories that I heard firsthand, and in my capacity as a medical doctor, working in the clinics and hearing the first-hand testimonies, I really believe that some of what I will tell you is absolutely shocking, but helps me reach my conclusion as to what's going on over there. I met an imam, for example, who is an imam for a village of 3,000 people. He reports one night when the army came into the village and he ran and he hid in the bushes with another friend of his. Approximately 3,000 people. He saw the men being mutilated, he saw the women being gang raped, and he talks of children, babies, being thrown onto burning fires. He watched all of this. I met mothers in the clinics who, like myself, have multiple children, and they had to take the decision whether to flee with the child that was still alive or go back to the fire to pull their child off of it after having been gang raped, after having watched their husband being mutilated. I received refugees over the border I saw them crossing, and the pain and anguish that was in their eyes. I don't know how these people found the strength. And as I stood there, dealing with my own emotions, able to come home to safety, security, the overarching question to me was, what makes their lives worth any less than ours? How, as an international community, can we ever, ever allow this to happen? In Rwanda, we said never again. Bosnia, we said never again. But in my opinion, humble as it is, here we are again.